I remember the exact way he said it, like he was commenting on the weather instead of ending something that had taken me decades to build. "You don't live here anymore." The door wasn't fully open, just enough for his face to appear in the narrow gap, as if the rest of the house had already decided I didn't belong inside it. I stood there on the porch, the same porch where I had once held him as a baby, where I had watched him take his first steps across uneven wooden boards I paid to have repaired, and I simply nodded. I didn't ask questions. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look past him, even though I could see the outline of someone standing just behind his shoulder. Instead, I lowered my eyes for a second, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, as if something quiet and final had just been confirmed. At my feet there was a small suitcase. Not mine. I hadn't brought anything with me that day except a container of chicken soup, still warm, wrapped carefully in a kitchen towel I'd owned for over 20 years. The suitcase was zipped, neat, placed just to the side of the welcome mat that still had my handwriting on the back from when I ordered it online. I noticed that before anything else. Then I noticed the new lock on the door. Silver. Clean. Not the one I had keys for. I shifted my weight slightly, feeling the cool air press against my arms, and I thought about how, just 72 hours earlier, I had been in my own kitchen chopping carrots, planning to bring dinner over because Daniel had sounded tired on the phone. He didn't say much these days. Just short answers. Distracted pauses. I had told myself it was work. Stress. Life. I had told myself a lot of things. I picked up the suitcase handle. It was lighter than I expected. That told me everything I needed to know about how carefully this had been planned. They had already decided what I was allowed to keep. Inside the house I heard a faint movement. Not footsteps. More like someone shifting their stance, waiting. I didn't look up. I didn't give them that moment. Instead, I adjusted the container of soup in my other hand, then realized there was nowhere to put it anymore. For a brief second I considered leaving it there on the porch like an offering that no one wanted. But I didn't. I held on to it. "Okay," I said quietly, more to the air than to him. My voice didn't shake. That seemed to surprise him. I could feel it in the silence that followed. No apology came. No explanation. Just the stillness of a door that wasn't going to open any wider. I gave one more small nod, then turned around. The steps felt familiar under my feet, each one measured, each one steady. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. At the bottom of the porch, I paused just long enough to set the suitcase upright and adjust my grip again. Across the street, a neighbor's dog barked once, then stopped. Everything else was quiet. Ordinary. As if nothing unusual had just happened. I walked to my car, placed the suitcase in the trunk, and sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting the engine. My hands rested calmly in my lap. There were no tears. Not anymore. Because somewhere between the unanswered calls, the polite distance, and the way that new lock gleamed in the afternoon light, I had already begun to understand. This wasn't sudden. It was prepared. And the truth was, so was I. I did not drive far at first, just a few blocks down, enough to park beneath a tall maple tree where the afternoon light broke into soft pieces across the windshield, and I sat there with the engine still off, listening to the ticking sound of metal cooling as if time itself needed a moment to settle. The container of soup rested on the passenger seat, still wrapped, still warm, and I placed my hand on it briefly, feeling the heat fade slowly, the same way certain truths reveal themselves, not all at once but in quiet layers. 72 hours earlier, I had stood in my kitchen measuring ingredients with the same care I always had, slicing carrots into even pieces, adding a pinch of salt the way Daniel used to like when he was younger, back when he would come home and ask what was for dinner before he even took off his shoes. That morning I had called him. He answered on the third ring. His voice was distant, thinner than I remembered. I asked if everything was all right. He said yes, just busy. I told him I would stop by later with something warm to eat. There was a pause, not long but noticeable, the kind that does not belong in a conversation between a mother and her son. Then he said, "That is not necessary, Mom." I smiled anyway, even though he could not see it, and said, "It is no trouble, I was already cooking." He did not argue. He just said, "Okay," and the call ended without the usual goodbye. I remember standing there for a moment, holding the phone in my hand, staring at the reflection of myself in the microwave door, noticing how still I looked. It was not the first time something had felt slightly off. Over the past few months, small things had shifted. Invitations came less often. Conversations became shorter. When I visited, Rachel would greet me politely, but her eyes would drift elsewhere, as if she were already thinking about the moment I would leave. She had a way of organizing things, of rearranging spaces, of deciding what belonged and what did not, and I began to notice that my presence no longer fit neatly into the life she was building inside that house. There was one afternoon about a month ago when I had stopped by unannounced, something I had done for years without hesitation. The driveway was full, but the curtains were drawn. I knocked, waited, then knocked again. Eventually, the door opened just a few inches, much like it had today, and Rachel stood there with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. She said they were just about to head out, that it was not a good time. I apologized, even though I had never needed to before, and walked back to my car with an unfamiliar heaviness in my chest. That was the first moment I allowed myself to consider that something had changed in a way that could not be explained by busyness or routine. A week after that, Daniel mentioned paperwork in passing, something about refinancing, about making things simpler, about handling the house more efficiently. He spoke quickly, using words that sounded rehearsed, as if he had already practiced explaining it to someone else. I listened carefully, not interrupting, not questioning, just letting each sentence settle into place. When he asked if I could stop by to sign a few documents, I agreed without hesitation. I remember the way Rachel placed the papers in front of me, neatly aligned, a pen resting perfectly across the top page. She smiled, calm and patient, and said it was just a formality, nothing complicated. I looked at the pages, at the small print, at the spaces where my name appeared, and I felt that same quiet shift again, like a door somewhere had begun to close without making a sound. I signed where they indicated, slowly, deliberately, aware of each stroke of ink, aware that I was giving something shape, even if they believed I did not fully understand it. And now, sitting in my car with the afternoon light fading and the soup growing cooler by the minute, I realized that the moment at the door had not been the beginning of anything. It had simply been the first time they said it out loud. The light had shifted by the time I finally started the engine, softer now, stretching longer shadows across the street as if the day itself was pulling away from what had just happened, and I drove without turning on the radio, letting the silence settle into something steady and familiar, the kind of quiet that does not demand answers right away. I did not go home. Not yet. Instead, I turned onto a road I had driven many times before, one that led past the bank where I had first opened an account decades ago, back when Daniel was still in school and every dollar had to be planned, measured, and accounted for. I pulled into the parking lot without thinking, parked near the entrance, and sat there for a moment, watching people come and go, each carrying their own routines, their own assumptions about what would still be waiting for them at the end of the day. I picked up my purse from the passenger seat and opened it slowly, moving past the usual things until my fingers found the envelope I had placed there 3 days earlier. It was still sealed, the edges crisp, untouched since the moment I had received it. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, not in ounces but in understanding. When Daniel had asked me to sign those documents, I had not refused. I had not questioned him in that moment. But I had asked for copies. I had said it lightly, almost casually, as if it were just a habit I had developed over the years. Rachel had hesitated, just for a second, before agreeing, her smile tightening in a way that most people would not notice. But I noticed. I always noticed the small things. Inside the envelope were those copies, every page, every signature, every line of fine print that most people skip over because they trust the person sitting across from them. I stepped out of the car, the air cooler now, carrying that faint early evening chill, and walked toward the entrance. The glass doors opened automatically, the familiar sound of the mechanism greeting me like an old acquaintance that had not changed. Inside, the lighting was bright, steady, the kind that does not leave room for shadows. I approached the counter and greeted the young man behind it with a polite smile. He did not know me. That was fine. I asked to speak with someone about a document review, something routine, something simple. He nodded and directed me to a small office off to the side. I sat down in the chair, placing the envelope on the desk in front of me, my hands resting calmly on either side of it. When the woman entered, she introduced herself, her tone professional, her movements efficient. I returned the greeting and slid the envelope toward her. I would like to go over these, I said. She opened it, scanning the first page, then the second, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly, Not into alarm but into focus. She leaned back slightly, reading more carefully now, her finger tracing a line of text as if confirming something she had suspected. I watched her without speaking, giving her the space to arrive at her own conclusions. After a moment she looked up at me, her voice measured, careful. "Did you sign these recently?" she asked. 3 days ago, I replied. She nodded slowly, then looked back down at the documents, turning another page, then another. The room remained quiet except for the soft sound of paper moving. I did not rush her. I did not fill the silence. I had learned a long time ago that the truth does not need to be forced. It reveals itself when given enough room. Finally, she placed the papers neatly back together and looked at me again, this time with a different kind of attention, one that acknowledged not just the documents but the person sitting across from her. "There are a few things here that we should discuss," she said. I gave a small nod, the same calm gesture I had given earlier that day. But this time it carried a different weight, something steadier, something already aligned with what I had begun to understand the moment I saw that new lock on the door. Because while they believed they had closed something behind me, they had also opened something they did not yet see. She did not rush into explanations, and I appreciated that because I had no interest in reacting quickly to something that had clearly been planned with patience. Instead, she turned one of the pages toward me, tapping lightly near the middle where a paragraph had been marked in small, precise print. I leaned forward just enough to read it clearly, my eyes moving slowly across each line, taking in every word the way I always had, not skimming, not assuming. The language was formal, carefully constructed, the kind that sounds harmless until you understand exactly what it allows. It referenced a transfer of occupancy rights, a reassignment of primary residence status, and a clause that seemed to suggest I had voluntarily relinquished my position within the property. I sat back slightly, letting that settle, not with shock but with recognition. This was what they believed they had secured. This was the version of the story they thought would hold. "It appears," the woman said gently, choosing her words with care, "that these documents were intended to formalize a change in residency and control over the property." I nodded once, slowly, my hand still resting calmly on the desk. "Yes," I said, my voice even. "That is what they told me." She studied me for a moment, as if measuring whether there was more beneath that sentence, and then she turned to another page, one that had been placed slightly out of alignment with the others. "However," she continued, "there is additional language here that does not fully support that outcome." I watched as she pointed to a section near the bottom, a part that had been easy to overlook if someone had only been interested in the larger headings and bolded terms. I leaned forward again, this time, more deliberately, and read the lines she indicated. They were clear. Quiet but clear. The kind of clarity that does not announce itself, but remains undeniable once seen. It outlined a conditional structure, one that tied any transfer of control to a separate agreement, one that required full disclosure and mutual acknowledgement of all financial contributions made toward the property over time. My name appeared again there, not as someone stepping away, but as someone whose involvement had been documented, measured, and preserved. I felt a small shift inside me then. Not relief, not satisfaction, but alignment, as if something I had already suspected had now taken its proper place. "Were you aware of this section when you signed?" she asked. I allowed a brief pause before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted the moment to remain steady. "I was aware that I needed to keep a copy," I replied. She gave a slight nod, understanding more than I had said. The room remained quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, one that carried direction instead of uncertainty. Outside the office, I could hear the faint sounds of the bank continuing its routine, doors opening, voices speaking, transactions being completed, all of it moving forward without interruption. Inside, everything had already shifted. She gathered the documents carefully, aligning them once more, then placed them back into the envelope with a level of precision that matched my own. "There are steps you can take," she said, her tone still measured, but now carrying a subtle firmness. "Nothing immediate needs to be decided today, but it would be wise to review this with legal counsel as soon as possible." I nodded again, that same small, controlled motion that had carried me through the day. "I understand," I said. And I did. Not just the documents, not just the language, but the intention behind it, the assumption they had made that I would not look closely, that I would accept what was presented without question, that I would step aside quietly without ever realizing the full shape of what had been done. I stood up, smoothing the front of my coat, and took the envelope back into my hands, feeling its weight again, this time with a different awareness. As I walked toward the door, I did not feel displaced. I did not feel uncertain. I felt something far more stable than that. Because while they had arranged everything to remove me from a place they believed was now theirs, they had also left something intact, something they had not accounted for, something that did not disappear just because a lock had been changed. And as I stepped back into the evening air, the coolness sharper now, the sky beginning to dim, I knew exactly what the next step would be, not out of anger, not out of urgency, but out of a quiet certainty that had been forming long before that door ever opened halfway. I did not go back to the house that night, and I did not call anyone either, because there are moments when silence is not avoidance but preparation, and I understood the difference very clearly as I drove toward a place I had not needed in years, a small extended stay hotel just off the highway where the lights in the parking lot hummed softly and the front desk clerk barely looked up when I signed my name on the check-in form, paying for a week in advance without hesitation because I had learned long ago that stability is not always tied to a single address. The room was simple, clean, nothing personal, just a bed, a chair, a small table by the window, and I placed the envelope there first before anything else, setting it down with the same care I used when arranging documents that mattered. The suitcase followed, light, almost symbolic now, and I opened it slowly, not to unpack, but to see what had been chosen for me, what had been left behind, what had been decided without my voice. A few changes of clothes neatly folded, a pair of shoes I had not worn in months, and at the bottom a photograph in a thin frame, one I recognized immediately, Daniel at 12 years old standing beside me in the backyard, both of us squinting into the sun, both of us smiling in a way that belonged to a different time. I held it for a moment, not with longing but with clarity, then set it on the table beside the envelope, aligning them carefully, past and present placed side by side without confusion. I sat down in the chair and looked around the room, letting my eyes adjust to the unfamiliar arrangement of space, and I realized that nothing in that house had truly been mine for a while, not in the way that matters, not in the way that cannot be reassigned with a document or a conversation behind a half-closed door. My phone rested in my purse, silent, unchanged, and I knew there would be no calls that night, not from Daniel, not from Rachel, because they believed the matter had been settled, completed, resolved in their favor. That belief was important. It gave me time. I reached into my purse and took out a small notebook, one I had kept for years, filled with dates, payments, notes written in my own careful handwriting, records of things that most people forget because they assume they will never need to remember them in detail. I flipped through the pages slowly, stopping at entries that marked the early years of that house, the down payment I had contributed, the repairs I had funded, the months when Daniel had struggled and I had stepped in without making it a condition, without asking for anything in return except the quiet understanding that family meant presence, meant support, meant continuity. Each entry was precise, dated, undeniable, not emotional, not exaggerated, just facts recorded over time. The kind of record that does not raise its voice but does not disappear either. I closed the notebook and placed it next to the envelope, creating a small, orderly line of things that now carried more weight than the entire house behind that locked door. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just slightly, looking out at the parking lot where cars came and went, where no one knew my name, where no one assumed anything about where I belonged, and I felt something settle into place within me. Not anger, not sadness, but a quiet structure, something firm, something patient. They had made their move with confidence, believing they had understood everything that mattered, believing they had reduced me to a signature on a page and a suitcase on a porch. But they had overlooked the one thing I had always relied on, not control, not confrontation, but attention, the habit of noticing, of recording, of keeping what others considered unnecessary. I turned back toward the table, toward the envelope and the notebook, and I knew that what came next would not require raised voices or sudden decisions, only a series of steps taken in the right order, at the right time, with the same calm I had carried from the moment that door opened only halfway. The night passed without interruption, and in the morning the room felt different, not more familiar, but more defined, as if it had already accepted me without question, and I moved through it with a steady rhythm, placing things where they needed to be, aligning the envelope and the notebook again on the small table before sitting down with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cool, the way I preferred it when I needed to think clearly. I opened the notebook once more, not to revisit what I already knew, but to organize what would come next, turning to a blank page and writing the date at the top in the same careful script I had used for years, then listing names, institutions, and timelines with a precision that did not require effort, because I had been preparing for this kind of clarity long before I knew I would need it. The bank officer had been right about one thing: there were steps to take, but steps only matter when taken in the correct order, and I had no intention of rushing into anything that would give them time to adjust their position. I reached for my phone and made the first call, not to Daniel, not to Rachel, but to a number I had kept saved under a simple name: Thomas Green, an attorney I had worked with once many years ago, when I first helped secure the structure of that house, when everything was still transparent and uncomplicated. The line rang twice before he answered, his voice older now, but still measured, still attentive. I introduced myself, and there was a brief pause, followed by recognition, the kind that carries a history of conversations built on trust rather than convenience. I told him I needed a document review, something recent, something that required careful attention. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply said he would make time that afternoon. I agreed and ended the call, placing the phone back on the table with the same calm I had carried since the moment the door had not opened any further for me. I spent the next hour reviewing the documents again, not searching for new information but reinforcing what I had already seen, making sure every clause, every condition, every reference point was clear in my mind without needing to be reinterpreted. There was a pattern in the language, one that suggested intention, but also one that revealed assumptions, and assumptions are often where control begins to weaken. By late morning I gathered everything: the envelope, the notebook, the photograph, and placed them neatly into my bag before leaving the room, locking the door behind me with a quiet click that felt more like a decision than a routine action. The drive to his office was familiar, lined with streets I had known for years, places that had not changed even as everything else had shifted, and when I arrived I parked in the same spot I used to prefer, near the side entrance where fewer people passed by. Inside, the office smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, a steady, unchanging environment that did not rush or react, and Thomas greeted me with a nod that carried both professionalism and a quiet understanding that this was not a casual visit. We sat across from each other, the documents spread between us, and I watched as he read through them carefully, his expression neutral, his focus sharp, not missing a single detail. He turned pages slowly, occasionally making small notes, occasionally pausing just long enough to consider the structure of what had been written. I did not interrupt him. I did not explain. I allowed the documents to speak in their own language because I knew they would. After some time he leaned back slightly, folding his hands together as he looked at me with a level of clarity that matched my own. "They moved quickly," he said, his tone even, not impressed, not concerned, simply stating a fact. I gave a small nod. "Yes," I replied. He tapped one of the pages lightly, not with urgency but with precision. But not carefully enough. The room remained quiet after that, but it was no longer the quiet of uncertainty. It was the kind that comes when something has been confirmed beyond doubt. I sat there steady, composed, not needing reassurance because I had already felt it the moment I saw that clause, the moment I realized that what they believed was final was, in fact, incomplete. And as Thomas began outlining the options available, each one grounded in structure, in process, in law rather than emotion, I understood that what would follow would not be loud, would not be rushed, but it would be exact, and it would be enough. Thomas did not raise his voice when he explained the options, and I did not expect him to, because nothing about this required urgency in tone, only precision in action, and he laid everything out in a way that felt less like advice and more like a sequence already waiting to be followed, each step connected to the next with a quiet certainty that did not leave room for confusion. He pointed again to the clause that had been placed so carefully within the document, the one that tied everything to full disclosure, and he explained that without a complete and accurate account of all financial contributions, any transfer of control could be challenged, not dramatically, not suddenly, but effectively. I listened without interrupting, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk, absorbing each detail the way I had absorbed every other detail over the years. Not reacting, not questioning unnecessarily, simply understanding. He asked if I had records, and I slid the notebook toward him without hesitation, opening it to the pages that mattered most, the entries written in my own hand, each one dated, each one aligned with specific payments, repairs, and contributions that had kept that house standing in ways that were never formally acknowledged but never absent either. He reviewed the pages slowly, occasionally nodding, occasionally pausing just long enough to confirm the consistency of what he was seeing. "This helps," he said finally, his tone measured, not surprised, but satisfied in a quiet way that did not need emphasis. I gave a small nod in return because I had known it would. We spent the next hour aligning the documents with the records, matching dates, confirming amounts, building something structured out of what they had assumed would remain invisible. There was no rush in the process, no sudden realization that changed everything in an instant, just a steady accumulation of clarity that made the situation less uncertain with every passing minute. When we were finished, he gathered everything into a single, organized file, placing each piece in its proper position, then closing it with a calm finality that felt appropriate for what had just been established. "We will proceed carefully," he said, meeting my gaze directly, "and we will not give them time to adjust what they have already set in motion." I understood exactly what that meant. This was not about confrontation. It was about sequence, timing, structure. I stood up, taking the file back into my hands, feeling its weight not as a burden, but as something balanced, something complete enough to move forward without hesitation. Outside, the afternoon had deepened into early evening again, the light softer, the air cooler, and as I walked back to my car, I noticed how steady everything felt. Not because the situation had changed, but because I had. I placed the file carefully on the passenger seat, then sat behind the wheel, allowing myself a brief moment of stillness before starting the engine. My phone remained silent, just as it had the night before, and I knew it would stay that way until something shifted on their side, until they realized that what they believed was finished had not settled as cleanly as they expected. I did not intend to call them. Not yet. There was no need to explain anything prematurely, no need to alert them to what had already begun to take shape. Instead, I reached into my bag and took out the photograph again, holding it for a moment, looking at the version of Daniel that had once trusted me without question, that had once understood the difference between presence and possession, between support and control. I placed it back down gently, not with regret, but with a quiet acknowledgement that people change in ways that documents sometimes reveal more clearly than conversations ever could. I started the engine then, pulling out of the parking lot with the same calm I had carried from the beginning, not accelerating, not hesitating, just moving forward at a steady pace, because everything that needed to be set in motion already had been, and everything that followed would unfold exactly as it needed to, not loudly, not suddenly, but with a precision that could not be undone once it had begun. The following morning did not arrive with urgency, and I did not treat it as if it should, because what had been set into motion did not require speed, only consistency, and I moved through the early hours with the same deliberate pace, reviewing the file once more at the small table, not searching for changes, but reinforcing the structure that had already been confirmed. By mid-morning, Thomas had sent the first formal notice, a carefully worded document that did not accuse, did not escalate, but simply required clarification, a request for full disclosure tied directly to the clause they had overlooked, and I knew the moment it was delivered would be the moment their certainty began to shift. I did not wait by the phone, and I did not check for messages because I understood that reactions take time, especially when someone believes they are secure. Instead, I stepped outside for a short walk, the air cool and steady, the kind that sharpens focus without distraction, and I allowed myself to observe everything around me, the passing cars, the quiet rhythm of the street, the ordinary movement of people who were not aware of anything beyond their own routines, and it reminded me that stability does not come from a single place, but from the ability to remain steady when that place is challenged. When I returned to the room, the phone was still silent, just as expected, and I placed it down again without hesitation, because silence at this stage was not absence, it was pressure building in a direction they could not yet see. It was not until later that afternoon that the first response came, not a call, but a message, short, controlled, written in a tone that attempted to sound neutral but carried a slight edge beneath it. Daniel had asked if there had been some kind of misunderstanding, if perhaps I had spoken to someone unnecessarily, as if the situation could still be contained within the version they had created. I read the message once, then placed the phone back down without replying, because this was not the point where I needed to explain anything, and any response now would only give them space to adjust their approach. Time was no longer on their side, even if they had not realized it yet. Another message followed an hour later, this one longer, more careful, mentioning the documents, referencing agreements, suggesting that everything had been handled properly, But the tone had already shifted slightly, less certain, more measured, as if the foundation beneath their confidence had begun to move just enough to be noticed. I still did not respond. Instead, I opened the file again, reviewing the notice that had been sent, tracing the language with my eyes, understanding exactly how it would be received, not as a confrontation, but as a requirement, something that could not be dismissed without consequence. That evening, as the light outside began to fade again, the phone rang, and this time I answered, not quickly, not hesitantly, but at a pace that matched everything else I had done. Daniel's voice came through first, controlled but tighter than before, and behind him I could hear Rachel, not speaking directly, but present, listening, waiting. He asked what was happening, why an attorney had been involved, why there were questions about documents that had already been signed. I listened without interrupting, allowing him to finish completely before I spoke, because clarity requires space, and I intended to use it properly. When I finally responded, my voice was steady, even without accusation, without emotion that could be used against me. I told him that nothing had changed except that everything would now be reviewed properly, that the documents would be understood in full, and that any assumptions made without that understanding would be addressed in the correct way. There was a pause on the other end, longer than any before, and in that silence I could feel the shift more clearly than in any words, the realization beginning to form that what they had believed to be settled was no longer fixed. Rachel spoke then, her voice carefully controlled, asking what exactly I was implying, and I answered in the same calm tone, that I was not implying anything, I was simply following what had already been written, what had already been agreed upon, and what had not yet been fully acknowledged. The call ended shortly after, not abruptly but without resolution, because resolution was no longer something they could define on their own. I placed the phone back down, returning it to its place beside the file, and I sat there for a moment, not reflecting, not reconsidering, but recognizing that the balance had begun to shift, quietly, precisely, in a way that could not be reversed by conversation alone. The next day unfolded with a clarity that no longer needed to be questioned, and by mid-morning Thomas called to confirm what I had already expected, that a formal response had been received, not a complete one, not a confident one, but a careful attempt to provide just enough information to appear compliant without fully addressing the requirement that had been placed before them. I listened as he explained the contents, the language measured but incomplete, the disclosures partial, the omissions subtle but present, and I could hear in his voice the same quiet certainty that had guided everything so far, that this was not the end of the process, but the point where it became undeniable. He asked if I wished to proceed, and I did not hesitate, because hesitation would only suggest uncertainty, and there was none left to consider. I told him to continue exactly as planned, to respond with the same precision, the same structure, to request full compliance without deviation, and he agreed without needing further clarification. After the call ended, I sat for a moment with the file open in front of me, the documents no longer feeling like something external, but something fully understood, something that had moved from uncertainty into definition. By early afternoon, the second notice had been prepared and sent, stronger in structure, clearer in expectation, leaving no space for partial answers or selective disclosure, and I knew that when it reached them, the shift that had begun the day before would deepen in a way they could no longer manage quietly. It did not take long for the response this time. The phone rang before the afternoon had fully settled, and when I answered, there was no attempt to soften the tone, no effort to maintain the same controlled distance as before. Daniel spoke first, his voice strained, not loud but no longer steady, asking why this was being pushed further, why it could not be resolved simply, why it needed to become something formal. I listened as I had done each time, allowing him to finish, allowing the weight of his own words to settle before I responded. When I spoke, my voice remained unchanged, calm even without any rise or edge, and I told him that nothing had become complicated, that it had always been structured this way, and that I was simply following what had already been established. Rachel's voice followed quickly, more direct now, asking if I was trying to reverse what had been done, if I intended to challenge the outcome they had already secured, and I answered with the same clarity that I was not reversing anything, I was ensuring that everything aligned with what had been required from the beginning. There was a pause then, longer than any before, and in that silence I could hear the realization settling more heavily, that this was not something that could be redirected with conversation, that it had moved into a space where only accuracy and completeness would matter. They spoke again, both of them, their words overlapping slightly, trying to reframe, to explain, to suggest that there had been no intention to leave anything out, that everything had been handled in good faith. But intention no longer carried weight where structure had already been defined. I did not argue, I did not interrupt, I simply let them speak until there was nothing left to add. And when the silence returned, I responded once more, steady and precise, that the process would continue, that everything would be reviewed fully, and that any final outcome would reflect what had been properly established, not what had been assumed. The call ended without resolution, but it no longer needed one, because resolution was already forming through the process itself. As the evening settled in, I closed the file gently, placing it back on the table with the same care I had shown from the beginning, and I allowed myself a moment of stillness, not to reflect on what had been lost, but to recognize what had been regained, clarity, control, and the quiet understanding that the door that had once been closed to me was no longer the boundary they believed it to be, and that what followed would not come through force or confrontation, but through the steady unfolding of something they could no longer avoid or undo.